So welcome everybody to the third panel session on this set of panels being held throughout this week, focusing on governance at the margins, understanding public authority in fragile and conflict and violence affected settings. My name is Anu Joshi. For those of you who might not know, I'm a fellow at the Institute for Development Studies, and I'm co-convening this panel with Katrina Barnes, who's the evidence uptake lead with Oxfam GB. She's also going to be speaking and presenting one of the papers in this panel. So this panel series has been born out of a stream of work that we're both involved in called Governance at the Margins, which is part of a larger 5-year research program focusing on accountability and empowerment within settings of fragility, conflict, and violence. The context of the panel is the following. Estimates suggest by 2030, more than 80% of the world's poorest will be living in contexts characterized by fragility, conflict, and violence, in which they experience governance from and through multiple sources of public authority beyond the official state. We know that in these contexts, a range of non-state actors matter: armed groups, rival political factions, religious leaders, informal and traditional institutions. And transitions from such contexts to what we're hoping relatively stable institutionalized states is fraught with challenges for people as well as institutions of authority. So we think that understanding public authority and legitimacy is an emerging challenge for strengthening inclusive governance in these settings. So this focus, the previous two sessions in the series were focusing on questioning what public authority was in these settings. And the second one was about legitimacy, how is it constructed? And this third session is going to focus on the blurring of boundaries between the formal and informal sources of public authority. Now, scholars often distinguish between formal and informal power, differentiating those who hold recognized institutionalized positions from those who have power without an official position. In countries with low state capacity or responsiveness and limited civic space, many actors emerge who blur these boundaries between the formal and informal and end up supporting particularly marginalized populations to access services. So thus defining actors as formal or informal is not so straightforward in these contexts. And we want to ask whether authority gained through legitimacy and norms rather than institutionalization. Are definitions of formal and informal even helpful in such contexts? So we're going to hear three very interesting papers that are hopefully speaking to the theme of this panel from various angles. The first, we're going to hear Mrs. Judith Cowlin from the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust and Ms. Talatu Aliyu, who's the media manager at Christian Aid Nigeria. And they're presenting a paper that they're working on with others, including Cas Semper, titled Accessing Public Services in Fragile Governance Settings, the Case of Disadvantaged Citizens in Myanmar, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. And I think they'll be presenting the cases of Nigeria and Zimbabwe. Sorry, now what happened? The next paper will be presented by Katrina Barnes, whom I've already introduced, along with Ong Myo Min, who's joined us from Yangon. And he's a researcher at the Oxfam country office in Myanmar. And this paper was written together with others, including Colin Anderson, who's a research officer at IDS. And the paper is titled Multiple Authorities, Multiple Accountabilities, Exploring Conflict-Affected Communities' Response to Governance Issues in Myanmar. The third paper is going to be presented by Dr. Akshay Mangala, Associate Professor at the University of Oxford. And his paper is entitled The Administrative Burden of Political Inclusion, How Police Agencies Implement Elections in India. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Tom Kirk, who's a senior researcher at the LSE's Center for Public Authority and International Development, as a discussant today. He's done a lot of work on public authority and thinking about it. So we'll be hearing his comments and reactions on the presentations, which will take us into a round of questions and a panel discussion. Just a few housekeeping things. During the presentations and the discussions, can I ask the audience to post questions on the chat box if you have any, while the presentations and discussion by the panelists is going on. And then the final part of the session, obviously, we'll do some open Q&A. And also, unless you're speaking, can you mute your mic? That would be very helpful. And if you're asking a question, please, can you keep your video turned on? It's nice to see people when they're speaking. It's great if you can keep your video on all the time, but sometimes I know that people have bandwidth problems. So let's start with the first paper. Over to you. I believe, Judith, you're starting?
Yes, and yes, thank you. I'm just going to wait for Cass to share the presentation. So thank you very much. I'm going to be co-presenting this with my colleague Talatu from Nigeria. And we are looking at the role of non-official actors in the access to public services by disadvantaged citizens in the two countries, that is Nigeria and Zimbabwe. And to do this project, we have our partners. We have just put logos there. I will not read through them, but you can see who the partners are for this study. We can go on to the next case. So really the purpose of our research is to understand how inclusive governance takes place in fragile countries. And by fragile here, we are referring both to places where there's armed conflict, where there's poor governance, issues of corruption, they all contribute to that fragility. And also the responses to the demands of disadvantaged citizens for public services. Maybe I could just highlight here that our colleagues from MEMA could not join us at this stage. I'm sure we are all aware of the recent coup d'etat that happened in the country. And for the study in both countries, we used mixed methods that included a survey, that included focus group discussions, and also interviews. So in Zimbabwe, we focused on access to health by people with disabilities from the age of 18 going forward. And you can see the map of Zimbabwe there. That red portion is the province in which we did the study. The study is within a larger project, which is called the Evidence and Collaboration for Inclusive Development. And in the country, it's actually in 2 provinces. But for the purposes of this study, we focused on that highlighted position in the country. My friend Talatu will speak more about the focus of their study in Nigeria, so I'll not speak to that one. Thank you, Akas. We can proceed. So, like I said, we were focusing on access to health for people with disabilities. And when we asked the respondents, who were 407 in total, what their main health provider was, because the obligation mostly rests with government to deliver on those services. So when we asked what their main health provider was, what we found was that 82% of the 407 respondents, that is those people with disability, responded that they use public health facilities, and 6% use private, 5% mission or clinic or hospitals, and 3% they use spiritual healers as the main provider, and 2% use none of those. But in the event where they cannot access the public health, when we asked them the alternative provider to their service, what we saw was that mission hospitals and spiritual healers really have a significant share as the alternative sources of providing health to people with disabilities. And 25% of those respondents told us that they could not get assistance that they require from public institutions for 3 main reasons. that either the services are not available, if they are available, they are not affordable, or they are not accessible infrastructurally. And where the people with disabilities could not get free services, 85% of them say that they cannot afford healthcare costs to meet the needs that they have as individuals with the healthcare needs. And so while generally people are covered by medical aid, and for us, in this particular case, 89% of the people with disabilities were not covered by any medical aid scheme that is existent in the country. And where they have to use resources to pay, and we ask them where they get the financial assistance from to use for their healthcare services, 67% said they get either from relatives or from neighbors, and assistance from government was only 14%, while 10% indicated they get their assistance from non-governmental organizations, or as well as other civil society or non-state actors. So what we conclude from this is that sometimes non-state actors, they complement the services that public services as the main provider should have, or in some cases where it's not existent, they actually replace what the state should be doing in terms of provision. And for good governance to happen, there has that relationship between the duty bearers and the rights holders. So what we found out was that there's no publicly shared database for people with disabilities. When we're focusing in the area that we're doing the research, and the majority of the people with disabilities get their information about health services that are available or where they can get health services from people with disability associations, which means the associations come in between and mediate the engagement between people with disabilities and the health providers. And where platforms for engaging with the health provider are available or do exist, what came out was that some of those platforms were not disability friendly in terms of accessibility for most of them. And 84% of those people with disabilities indicated that they had the capacity, because they engaged with associations, they actively participated in programs through associations, that they now had the capacity to hold duty bearers to account. And what also came out was that there was a higher chance of someone to be able to hold a duty bearer to account if that person has the knowledge. But what we saw was about 62% of those people that we interviewed were not members of associations. So they would then lack in this particular knowledge. So to conclude here, what we saw was that, Anu, are you speaking?
Yeah, I was saying you're almost out of time. Sorry, I said I would give you a warning.
Okay. All right. So what we saw in regards to relationship was that relationships are mainly mediated since people with disabilities engage through associations. Cass, we can proceed. And so the implications from these findings, one of the major implications was that since most of the people with disabilities rely on associations and not government, it means that there is a weak engagement between themselves and government. And the result is that then governance will be very weak in that regard. And as an organization, at the time of doing the research, we do appreciate that the government itself launched the first national disability policy. Maybe colleagues can see this report. It was the first of its kind that was launched, which coincided with our research, and we appreciate, and we see a convergence between what the policy is trying to commit to and what our research findings were. For example, we both see the importance of people with disability associations as they play a key role, not only in terms of giving information, but also in terms of capacity building of the people with disabilities. And that the policy itself is an entry point because it indicates that anybody who's going to be doing any research on disability has to submit those results with the Department of Disability, which means there's room to influence policy formulation and policy implementation. And the participation of people with disability is also acknowledged in both the report and in our findings in the research. Yeah, let's go on, Cass, to the last one. And importance of a database is also highlighted, but we feel that there is need to raise more awareness about even the associations that are there, the schemes that are there that are targeting people with disabilities. So we raise that. And in concluding, maybe we are just saying, as an organization that is doing this research at this time, and where government is making some pronouncement through a commitment through the policy, that while we acknowledge that, we think it is more important to then translate the commitments on paper into reality through implementation. So we continuously see the opportunity to engage, to then push for the implementation and realization of the commitments in the paper so that we move from that policy production to policy implementation. I think at this stage, I'll hand over the stick to my colleague Talat to speak about Nigeria. Thank you very much, Anna.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, let me speak about Nigeria. So for us in Nigeria, we looked at 2 states, one in the southeast and one in the northwest in Nigeria. So for us in Nigeria, we are working in Anambra State and Kaduna State. Anambra is in the southeastern part of Nigeria, and Kaduna State is in the northwestern part of Nigeria. Next slide. So we had worked in 4 of each of the locations in these states, and the choice of the location were selected based on those with the least access to services and lowest human development index. So if you look at from the presentation, I will be speaking offhand, you can read from the presentation. So these are the 4, we tried to look for about 3 groups that we had the research on for us in Nigeria. We looked at adolescents, boys and girls between the ages of 13 and 19. Then we looked at people with disability and poor rural women who are aged 18 years and above and living in hard to reach communities. So these are our findings from the research. And basically, for us, what we try to seek from this is to ensure that services are better available for these adolescent girls and people with disability and the poor rural women. You can keep going on the next slide. I'm not going to read them because of time. Then also we seek to increase the contribution of adolescent girls, people with disability and poor rural women in decision-making processes. We also seek to increase the successes and strength of civil societies to address the issues of adolescent girls, people with disability, and the poor rural women. We have worked with the government, we have worked with civil society, we have worked with also the relevant stakeholders in these areas of intervention. And also, we seek to make government respond better to the needs of the adolescent girls and people living with disability and poor rural women. So if you have read from the PowerPoint presentation, you see how the different individuals have responded to the questions. Participation in decision-making, only 87% out of the 300 adolescent boys and girls in Kaduna State say that they do not participate in decision-making. But in Anambra State, 60% out of 372 adolescent boys and girls that we have interviewed think that their traditional rulers and councillors are resisting their demand for improved services. It will interest you to know that in Nigeria, we have different dynamics. In the north, what is applicable in the northern part of Nigeria is quite different from what is applicable in the southern part of Nigeria. So their responses are very divergent, but in terms of mobilization for the two states, we found out that people living with disabilities are more organized than any other marginalized groups, talking about adolescent boys and girls and talking about poor rural women. In the two states, we found that these persons with disability are more mobilized because they have an umbrella head that takes responsibilities of their needs and have that channel to speak with the government. So most of these marginalized groups are only mobilized through their group leaders or representatives, as we have no established government platform or mechanism for mobilizing and having a formal engagement of this group. Next slide. Next slide, please. Let's go for the implication. So for us in Nigeria, the implication is that inadequate access to free education for adolescent boys and girls contributes to social challenges such as substance abuse, teenage pregnancy, hawking, child abuse, and child trafficking. We also have that inadequate access to basic health services contributes to infant and maternal mortality, especially for rural women in the hard-to-reach communities. It also leads to spread of diseases which could have been prevented. And also the exclusion of marginalized groups from decision-making processes contributes to inefficient resource allocation and weak capabilities among this service agency. So the project will tend to help government to use information about the needs of communities to plan for their community development. So that is it for us from Nigeria. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much for some really interesting findings, early findings from your work in Nigeria and Zimbabwe. We move next to the paper by Katrina and Myo Min. Katrina, over to you.
Thank you, Anu. Let me just share my screen. Can I just check that you can see that?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Katrina Barnes, and at the time of this research, I was working as Oxfam Myanmar's Strategy and Impact Director. The team behind the research comprises of myself, Ang Myo Min, who is co-presenting with me today and coordinated the bulk of the research, and Colin Anderson from the Institute of Development Studies.
Katrina?
Yeah?
I'll just interrupt. Your note slides are also showing. You might want to be in your PowerPoint.
Oh, that shouldn't be the case. Why is that
happening?
It's good, we're following, it's subtitled.
Okay, that's very strange. Just bear with me.
Now it's good.
Now it's good. Okay, fantastic. This research is part of the Governance at the Margins stream of the Action for Empowerment and Accountability program. And for 4 years now, we've been working alongside teams in Mozambique and Pakistan who have all presented at the previous panels. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about our motivations for doing this work. With the exception of some work on limited statehood, there is a bias in much political science towards the importance of the nation state, and often big assumptions about the reach of the state and the uniformity of political arrangements across locations. However, we know that local governance systems, both formal and informal institutions and individuals, play a more direct role in everyday governance and people's interactions with authorities. This goes far beyond the decentralization agendas of nation states. So Myanmar's then transition, so we started this in about 2016, led theorists and development actors alike to prioritize the big governance changes of the state. So things like national institutions, elections, etc. focus on local governance, often centered around constitutional debates on decentralization, and in some circles around federalism. As you can see from the map on the screen, much of Myanmar's territories are contested, with both armed and political oppositions claiming control and de facto governance of various areas. These groups often have separate armed wings and administrative or governing wings. This results in a mosaic of overlapping authorities which communities need to navigate. Sometimes these are in armed conflict, sometimes they work in parallel, sometimes they collaborate. So to give you an example, in one of our research locations, there were 5 different authorities, all taking on various elements of governing. From a development programmatic lens, peace programming, which tended to engage with these groups, and governance programming, which tended not to, at the time we commenced the research, were still quite separate. Whilst many people working in Myanmar are very aware of the complicated realities of governance in some of the border areas, there are only few examples of these realities being deeply integrated into governance programming. Yet there was a drive from funders for development actors to begin to target conflict areas more and more. Therefore, the research sought to find out what was happening at a very local level, flipping the lens to start by asking how marginalized people in a range of different conflict-affected areas got their problems resolved, and in a follow-up phase, how those that act on their behalf or help them solve problems navigate these roles. We had a specific focus as well, looking at trust and people's expectations of authorities. So the research overtly took a more anthropological stance. So we returned to the same households to effectively have a cup of tea. So sit down and have a chat every month for a year, using what has now become known as the governance diaries approach. Once understanding that people largely did not engage with authorities directly, in phase 2, we then took a similar approach with monthly visits to those who they would engage. So we called these intermediaries. We started expanding on the governance diaries approach and used a basket of various tools within this, drawing on things like institutional mapping, social network analysis, and life histories. And then, of course, adapting to and exploring the impacts and realities of COVID-19. I also just want to pause to note here that the research commenced and concluded before the recent Myanmar military coup, and any references in our findings to the government refer to the then NLD government. And I want to hand over to Ang Myong Min now to take us through some key findings.
Yeah. As these research were carried out in the contested remote area, there are multiple high authority people can engage with. This raises the question, with authority are legitimate. People can recognize an organization as the government and refer them as that. It varies between the organization, but on the whole, at the end, organization can deliver services, collect tax, and have their own legal system. Most people don't go to any government authority if they have a government issue. If they have a government issue, people prefer to solve them locally and seek the help from those who they familiar, reliable within their network. Mostly, they seek help from the intermediary who are social activists, village administrator, and village administrator. If they want to decide to raise an issue, people generally don't have a choice which authority they go to. Intermediary have the authority across the communities, but also makes the decision on what gets escalated and to which higher level authorities. Intermediary work within the network or local governance, either their village or the group of village. We found a significant self-reliance with issue really escalated to the outside of this intermediate network. Where there is a greater contestation, there were less engagement with the higher level authority. In some villages, even have the aspect rule VDA selected, which rules should be applied in their communities. Governance at the communities have happened through the network. These networks very dependent on the specific community, don't necessarily align with the higher level authorities. They involve elder, business elite, ex-administrator, judicial representatives, and also sometimes guards, security, youth, and women representative. Intermediary are negotiator. Once they solve the issue, they are incented not to escalate. and to solve themselves. The negotiation between the two parties, they try to make the issue small and a small issue go away instead of paying attention to the human rights. We found the level of violence and conflict present in the impact of the intermediary, the role of intermediary, and the characteristics in which are important for an intermediary, the nature of network, and we reinforce the shared reliance. The primary role became to protect the community from the governing actors as being intrinsically part of the conflict, rather than going to them say as a duty barrier. And this diagram represents a few episodes that can inform our research. We mapped out who intermediary want to and what strategy they use to solve the issue. The intermediary are largely informed from the perspective of the higher authority. And for the most authority, they don't show it in the office structure nor their page. They are viewed as a legitimate authority from the perspective of the communities. They are sometimes either appointed or elected. In some cases, they work in the committee with other authorities. In some contested area, there is 2 military administrators, which are only intermediate with more formal role. One is elected by a military administrator and recognized by the union government, while another one is appointed by an organization. Community inform these leaders not necessarily because of trust, but because of their responsibility, power, and legitimacy. Trust doesn't associate with either formal or informal leader. Trust emerges from their familiarity and reliability. These intermediaries engage with both former state authority, but also engage with a non-state actor, such as an organization, a traditional council, sometimes other village leader, and also to help them. As you can see from this diagram, sometimes they involve more than one authority. Sometimes the authority shop, sometimes non-state actors such as EU coordinate with the state. According to the law, intermediary and other leaders are not allowed to make the trial or decision on the cases. However, this is the common practice in more villages, and community members prefer to solve the issue locally. For example, during the COVID period, the government made overall policy. The leader made decision to lock down the village or not to lock down the village. As an organization to enforce the policy, this shows the how interaction between the informal rule at the village level and the state and non-state actor at the higher level. Katrina.
Thank you, Myeon-min. So just to quickly summarize, the blurring of roles calls into question the relevance of a distinction between the formal and informal in the lived experience of governance for many people in Myanmar. A key takeaway here is that roles not considered formal on paper are very much formal to the people that interact. They are legitimate expressions of public authority for many people. Finding alternative or non-state forms of authority, such as ethnic armed organizations, in a context like Myanmar that's faced civil war and social divisions, is an expression of contesting the state and its legitimacy. But equally, village level governance remains focused in many ways on actively not involving authorities and finding local or customary solutions. Taken together, this presents an even greater challenge to a top-down and centralized view of governance that often assumes uniform reach and importance of state institutions across territory. We see this as being important intellectually in terms of scholarly interest, but also having critical implications for development policies and practices. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Katrina and Myeon-min. Some really interesting food for thought, particularly on the role that intermediaries play, both as formal interlocutors in some cases, but more often as informal, and the fact that intermediaries have the choices of authority to go to rather than the people themselves. So some really interesting stuff there. We move now very quickly to the third presentation by Akshay, and then we'll follow by comments. Akshay, I'll give you a warning at about 1 minute before time is up. Thanks.
Sure. I'll just share my screen. I hope it is visible to everyone. Great. First, thanks to Anu and to Katrina for organizing this panel. This has been a great set of presentations, and I really am looking forward to the discussion. And also thank you to Tom, our discussant, for putting together comments, notwithstanding the unavailability of a paper on my side. So I'm going to be presenting some preliminary findings from an ongoing research project on police reform in India. So I've been working with the police in the state of Madhya Pradesh, northern central India, on a series of reforms around different aspects of policing. So one of our studies is around policing reforms for women's security. And so we're looking at the impact of dedicated services towards women and the integration of female officers in the state of Madhya Pradesh. We're doing a separate study around police training and capacity building to improve police responsiveness to marginalized groups. And in the process of doing this research, many things happened. And one of those things were elections. And elections happen frequently in India. And it turns out that this is one of the key tasks for the police. It's not something that I had initially planned to study or put together any sort of research around, but rather just came up, and it actually pulled the police away from a lot of their day-to-day crime fighting and citizen front-facing responsibilities to organize and implement these large-scale events. And so I took it on as an opportunity, largely for ethnographic research around how the police try to implement elections. And the backdrop of this is the question of how do states that are still developing, how do these democratic states that are developing establish legitimacy, especially when their politics is highly clientelistic, patronage driven, and they operate within settings of highly entrenched social inequalities. And within this sort of broad question, I'm focusing on the Indian state. And the Indian state gets a lot of attention for being relatively effective among developing countries for the performance of its electoral democracy, at least with regards to the conducting of peaceful elections that are broadly inclusive at high rates of voter turnout. So what allows the Indian state to do this relatively well, given what we know about the Indian state regarding its overall weak institutional capacity in a whole range of policy areas, including security and policing? And this question about the sort of implementation of elections turns on the police, because the police are the key agency in charge of conducting elections in India. So this motivated me to look at the administrative mechanisms within the police for trying to establish legitimacy of the electoral process on an everyday mundane level. So in the kind of routine practices of administering the election. And so how do these activities, what are these activities? How are they carried out? And then I want to think about in this project, the links between these activities during elections to the everyday aspect of policing between elections. And so I'll just encapsulate a few points from the argument at the outset, so you know where I'm headed. So what I'm arguing here is that the police are operating in a context of severe resource constraints. I'll say a bit about that and show some data. And they face significant political interference in India. When trying to register a case, it's very often the police will face some interference by a political leader or by a locally notable elite. And yet, notwithstanding this context, police agencies in India understand their own role in elections as an opportunity to actually redeem themselves in the eyes of the public and establish legitimacy for the state. One of the background conditions that allows this to take place is that there's significant external oversight of the police during elections. So the Election Commission of India has election observers from different states traveling around during state elections. And what I'm looking at here are actually state or provincial level elections, not the national elections, but elections within a state, which are significant in terms of size and so on, but also extensive media and public scrutiny. So this puts a lot of pressure on the police to appear unbiased. And the other part that I argue is that the police actually draw on their pre-existing norms and routines. So this paper may not fit so neatly in the sort of informal institutions dichotomy around the panel. But I do think that it does speak to this issue about agency norms and how the pre-existing routines and what I call the law and order culture of the police is so well ingrained that this becomes a resource to plan and monitor election-related activities and events. There's a contradictory norm within the police, which gains less expression in everyday policing, but is quite prominent in elections, which is the Janta Seva norm, the public service norm, which is an orientation towards marginalized groups and efforts to harness their participation, particularly around elections. This includes religious minorities, lower castes, and women. And this is in significant contrast to what I observe in terms of police's everyday treatment of these very same groups outside of elections. And what I will try to reflect on is this concept at the end on episodic state capacity, that the political emphasis on order and legitimacy around large-scale events, and elections in India are extremely large and involve large amounts of a movement of people, but also planning and oversight. This emphasis on public order and legitimacy around these events comes at the cost of actually building the capacity of the police to conduct the routine everyday policing and encourage their responsiveness towards marginalized groups. So let me just start. One is the kind of background. I'm not going to go too much into the context, but just a little bit, that India still operates according to the 1861 Police Act from the colonial era, which put in place a highly militaristic police hierarchy. Indian citizens consistently view the police as one of the most, if not the most corrupt public agency in India. The police are considered clientelistic and patronage driven. There's research by Milan Vaishnav showing that the level of criminalization in Indian politics is only growing. And there's a massive growth of private security in India. So the kind of numbers that I've come across is that the private security in India is something like 8 or 10 times as large as the police and the standing army of India combined. And so the police are operating in this backdrop of not being necessarily trusted and political interference. And these are just some quotes by scholars of Indian politics and policing who find that the police lack trust and legitimacy, and the political class does not have an interest in encouraging police to develop into a competent autonomous agency. Police also suffer from low capacity. So the police to population ratio is a common a statistic used. So India's is about 1.2, which is less than half that of China and other developing countries. Even among developing countries, it's on the lower end. There's high rates of vacancy. So 25% of sanctioned posts for constables are vacant, and even higher rate of vacancy for middle and senior ranks. The context in Madhya Pradesh, real quickly, it's a large state in northern central India. It's a state that's had two-party competition between the two national parties, Congress and BJP. And the elections I looked at were in 2018. And in this election, the Congress party actually unseated the incumbent BJP. And I think this is an important test case for police capacity to establish the legitimacy of elections, because the BJP has been governing at the center in India's federal system and has become the dominant political party in this state, which is a critical state for the BJP, given its size and location in the Hindi-speaking region. The fact that Congress won is kind of an indication that India's kind of political or the sort of electoral democracy has some robustness to it. So what I did here, one, I conducted a large number of interviews with officers within police stations, and this is part of my kind of broader project that I had shared with you, or I described at the beginning. I conducted ethnographic work in 3 districts and in 14 police stations, and this was to observe the everyday police thana. Thana is the police station, and observe their activities, their meetings, officer trainings, and then I observed election activities in 3 districts. Along with this, we have a representative survey of police officers in 180 police stations across 12 districts of Madhya Pradesh, covering virtually every broad region of the state. And it's representative with respect to rank, though we oversampled female officers because there are not that many in India. It's about 7% of the police force is comprises of women. And so we wanted to have more women in the survey so we could get their perspective. So just a quick last point on context. I'll just point you to the bottom two bullet points, which is that officers in Madhya Pradesh who I interviewed felt disempowered, even though they have a lot of power. So they talk about the Rajnetik Dabav, which means political pressures on them, which are significant and can be an impediment to their work. So, you know, a classic case is I took someone in who was committing a crime, and then I got a phone call from an elected official or some leader, and I was told to release that person, and that's a big source of demoralization. And corruption is deeply institutionalized within police stations. There's going rates for various services. The interviewees at the same time, and this is pointing to the kind of, you could say, contradictions within an agency, that the interviewees identify social status as a key motivation for having joined the police. So the uniform, the vardi commands izzat or respect. I'll just move along here. So officers from the survey believe that, or report that the lack of resources affects their policing work. So from this pie chart, very roughly, 44% say that the lack of resources is such a challenge that some work cannot be done, and another 32% say that most work cannot be done. So effectively, 3/4 of the police say that some or most policing work cannot be done because of severe resource constraints. Now, around the elections, this was election time in November through December 2018. Voting occurred in multiple phases over several weeks. The Election Commission of India kind of oversees everything. They set a model code of conduct. This is a central government agency that sets the norms and appropriate practices for political parties, candidates, and for the police. And the state police forces are the nodal agency for conducting the election. And what I observe is effectively that the police's pre-existing orientation and training towards law and order, which is to prevent large-scale communal violence, to prevent booth captures and other things, helps prevent the escalation of conflicts between different groups. One thing that the Election Commission mandates, which is aimed at encouraging independence of the police, is that there's a mass transfer of officers. So officers that have spent 3 years or more within a district are mandated to be transferred to another district. And this is part of an effort to create an autonomous police that's independent of the local established political establishment. And so during my fieldwork, approximately 10% of officers were transferred to a new district in anticipation of the election. And just to pause for a moment, that's a significant movement of personnel for any type of organization, let alone an organization that's across the geographic expanse of a state as large as Madhya Pradesh. Senior officers view this positively. They say the mandated transfers helps ensure the police are unbiased during elections. But when you start talking to the local level officers, you get a different story, that actually all the relationships and local knowledge that we had developed to fight crime, the social networks we built with communities, all of those get upended for the purpose of this large scale event. So in some sense, this is the flip side of trying to establish an unbiased autonomous police force. You get an agency that becomes disembedded in many ways from the local community, and that affects everyday crime fighting. There's various law and order activities that the police engages in prior to the election. So there's local intelligence gathering, and some of this could include working with local religious leaders and what are called these police committees. Sorry, that should not say peace communities, it should say peace committees, to monitor suspicious activities. They infiltrate WhatsApp groups, and I observed firsthand that under the BJP rule, which is commonly associated with Hindu nationalism, the police were actively monitoring Hindu nationalist rallies and preventing certain individuals from even entering a district to make an inflammatory speech. In one district, I observed them establish strong presence in a Muslim neighborhood over several weeks to establish trust with the community and encourage them to actually go out and participate in voting. There's, again, a very systematic law and order practice around monitoring of voting booths. the booths are categorized by the risk of political violence around each booth into critical, semi-critical, and normal voting booths. And critical booths are monitored heavily with a heavy presence of police personnel to maintain order and limit interactions between opposition groups, limit voter intimidation. Similar kinds of systematic activities are conducted to handle the electronic voting machines to ensure there's no tampering.
Akshay, you have 1 minute.
Okay. I'll say the last bullet point here and then turn to another slide. So the public testing of electronic voting machines was one of the key interesting observations about establishing legitimacy. The police have both competing parties stand in front of the electronic voting machine, and both of them practice voting. And so once they feel that the machine is not rigged, only then does that machine get cleared. And that's an informal norm. That's not even required by the election commission, but it's an interesting way to build local, you could say, confidence in the voting booths. The other is a set of activities on securing turnout. There's an informal norm to target 65% turnout. And I was with officers throughout the day on voting days, and on their radios, they're constantly asking each other, what is the turnout? What is the turnout? And if it goes way too much above 65%, they get concerned that there could be some fraudulent voting happening. So they immediately rush to the voting booths. If it's too low, then they try to encourage more voting. And these are some of the activities they do. They have women-only pink booths, which are run by female officers, and they aim to conduct outreach activities to women's groups. They have transport services for voters who are elderly and those with disabilities. So just a concluding reflection. So these activities are geared towards legitimacy enabled by the competitive political environment and outside monitoring. But I consider this a case of episodic state capacity. It's capacity that's developed around an episode, around the elections and large-scale law and order events. And the outreach, while it could be developed further, it's undermined by the mass transfer of officers and weakens ability to address everyday individual security concerns of citizens. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Thank you, Akshay. I think there's some really interesting connections between your paper and the earlier paper, even though you said there aren't, having to do with informal networks that operate, as well as the concern with legitimacy. But I'll leave Tom, who's thought about these issues much more, to take on the task of commenting on these three papers. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Anu. Thank you to all the speakers. I know that this year, well, more than a year now, has been difficult. And I know that some of the contexts that you guys are working in are extremely difficult. So nothing is normal and we live in weird times. So the fact that you even managed to turn up and do a speech or a presentation is really good. And I appreciate it very much. Thank you. So because I didn't have papers and because your talks were so rich, I'm probably going to just say a lot of questions I have to follow up, and I don't expect you to answer them all in any which way, so pick what's most interesting to you and talk. So I'm going to give you a bit of observations, ask a lot of questions, and feel free to kind of respond to whatever you want. Don't feel that you have to in any way. At the outset, I should say it's really great to see that people are like taking this whole public authority idea seriously, especially people who are thinking about what that means for development programming, because I think it's an idea or a kind of concept that's been around in ethnographic literature for a long time, but the gig is to apply it to real practitioner and real things that are going on the ground rather than leaving it in dusty books. So it's really heartening to see that happening, something that I kind of try and push in my own work. So let's start with Judith and Talatu in Nigeria and Zimbabwe. Thank you very much for your talk. I've got loads of notes here, so bear with me. It's nice to write with a pen for the first time in a long time. Okay, so I was really interested at the top that immediately you show that the alternative providers in Zimbabwe are really important, the missions and the spiritual leaders. And this is something I see again and again in my own work. And it begs the question for me, I wonder if people, do they actually expect any of these services from the state anymore? Or in some places I've worked, they're so used to services being provided by religious actors that the state kind of gets a free pass on the day-to-day health services, and it's just considered at best a security actor and at worst a kind of predatory predatory public authority in some ways. I was really interested in the low coverage of the aid schemes that you mentioned for people with disabilities. I wonder, is that linked to a lack of documentation? Is it linked? What's the reasoning behind that? So if people with disabilities aren't able to engage in these schemes, what's going on? And then later on, you talked about how actually most people are using their own social networks, their family and their neighbours to access services, 67%. This is something I see again and again in places I work in development programs. And then there's that whole idea that if people don't have social networks, are they become marginalized by their lack of connections? And it really makes me think that back in a way, we're back to the whole social capital argument and how can you build it? And that was kind of discredited for a long time, but this kind of more nuanced work on social capital and less economical work, I think is really interesting and needs to be revisited. So it's good to hear about that. And then another big thing you guys talked about was the role of associations for people with disabilities. I really want to know if loads of people have a knowledge of associations, why aren't more people involved in them? Are they exclusive somehow? Who runs them? Who sets them up? What's their kind of, are these associations inclusive? And how are they seen by the government? And you made the suggestion that this kind of alliance on the disability associations engenders or cultivates weak governance. I want to know why you say that, because that seems a bit of a leap to me. I know that they're an intermediary, as you say, between people and the state, but why is that necessarily a bad thing? So what's it about associations that you think makes weak governance? Because I don't think that we should necessarily see intermediaries as bad in all circumstances, right, or somehow taken away from governance. Moving on to, just check the section on Nigeria. Again, here, that was really interesting. You talked about people with disabilities being really well organized compared to other social groups. I really want to know why, because I've seen that in some places I've worked. You often find that the representatives of disabled people's groups are putting their hands up and coming to speak to you as a foreigner first. And what's it about them that manages them to do that? Is it desperation, or have they been engaged in the past by organizations that help them and empower them in some way, shape or form? And then also your really important point about the differences in the two places where you conducted your research. You've got one place where people are happy to go to their heads and their local public authorities in order to get access to services, and another place where they're not. You didn't quite tell me why that is, and I would love to know, because I think we all find in the places we work that every 100 meters you've got a different governance setup and a different local context. But what's the explanation for that? So yeah, if you're willing to expound on that, I think it's quite important. And that makes me think, jumping to your implications, if it is so different or different places in Nigeria, you talked about how there's a lack of state formal mechanisms for interactions between citizens and state. But is that actually the solution everywhere? If in some places people are completely scared of authorities, can we have blanket solutions? Do we need tailored kind of mechanisms in different places where there's different histories of authority state citizen interactions? Okay, so on this second talk, let me just find my notes on it. Excuse me. Okay. The second talk, Myanmar. The things that really stuck out for me, because I also had your big PDF that I could read, which was really useful ahead, so thanks for that. The self-reliance and avoidance of authorities across your kind of research areas, especially avoiding the government. I think that's something that really gets to the heart of what a lot of development programs misjudge, is there's an assumption that people want to have connections to authorities and mechanisms to engage them in some of these places we work. Whereas actually there might be a fear of authorities through decades of predatory behavior by them, or being in the wrong ethnic group, or whatever it happens to be. And that's something I think we're not alive to, which feeds into the whole chat about conflict sensitivity and doing it properly and understanding what different groups understand, perceptions of the state are and histories with it. You also talked, interestingly, in the paper, and alluded to it in your talk about how the kind of post-conflict distinction perhaps doesn't work in a lot of the places you were working, and people's perceptions of the local authorities are shaped by that history of conflict and what those individuals did during the conflict. And I think that's, again, something that is often overlooked. We move into this post-conflict development stage and we think that somehow there's a closed door for people, when actually, no, there's not. And the people who are the new leaders in that post-conflict period are quite often the leaders from the conflict. What do we do about that? Because we're engaging people who may have been human rights abusers at one end, or may have been local heroes at another. Like, how does development get its head around that problem? And then lastly, which is not going to please many people, you said that civil society organizations are not that influential and trusted. Yeah, again and again, like that's something I see in the places I work. Like quite often they're shells or briefcase organizations. So what does that mean for the development community? How do we move past that? If the civil society organizations, the ones with the websites, are able to speak the English, what do we do to get below to that level of authorities that maybe do have some kind of trust built in? Okay, I've got a lot more. Hold on. Give me a minute. Noted. Okay. Slowly. Again, you guys, it's a kind of a theme through many of the talks. You talked about how the less networked people you were speaking to, they could be marginalized just purely by the forms that are less networked. I think, again, that's really important, comes back to the social capital. And then in your 3 little case studies, what you seem to be describing sounds a lot like forum shopping to me. You show that people are going from place to place to kind of get their disputes resolved or mediated. How much agency have they got in that? Like, that would be something to look into. Like, is this something, are they being bounced from places to places, or are they actively moving from place to place? And then you talked about this need for money for access, and even in the kind of informal, as we might call them, or the informal forums that people go to, money plays a role. Does that mean that we, as development programmers or programs, can start paying for this access? Is that something we can do? I'm not really sure. But like, where does that come in? You know, but the reality is money is needed to access services in a lot of the places that we're talking about. That's just a fact of life, and to ignore it would seem reductive, if not slightly dangerous. And that kind of brings me to another point. In these supposedly post-conflict places, if we don't have a contextual understanding of the sort you're talking about, can we ever safely engage as outsiders? And if we can't, how do we support local organizations to do that? I feel sometimes that the danger of not knowing the local political context down to that kind of village level can risk causing longer term problems, or supporting oppressive or anti-democratic or networks and public authorities. So it's great that we're recognizing public authorities, but like, they come with a big warning sign, I think, right? Especially for development access. Okay, moving on. Ashke, thank you for bringing us to India. I've got a background of working in Pakistan, which is comparable in some ways, especially when it comes to the police force, I think. So it was nice to hear about the police in India, but I don't know it that well. Your big problem of like, how does the state create legitimacy for itself in what is essentially a clientelistic political atmosphere? I think that's something I'm really interested in tackling all the time, because clientelism hasn't disappeared in both Pakistan and India, but the states do have quite a high level or modicum of legitimacy in some instances. I think there's a whole literature that you might want to explore about old forms of clientelism and new forms of clientelism, with the distinction being in the olden days, clientelism was much more based around the family unit and had a higher level of kind of morality and put over it, whereas the new form of clientelism is something you see in young democracies. It's much more transactional, and it's much more episodic in the way that you then later describe governance. In a sense, people engage the state and sell their votes or their services for when they want something in return, but there's not these long-term allegiances. And I wonder if states, the new young democracies, kind of realize that, and the new intermediaries are good at doing that. The focus on the police was interesting for me, because in the centre I work at LSE, we do see the police as public authorities as well, even though they're part of the state. Mainly because they blur quite often in these contexts that distinction between the informal and formal through the actions they do. Yeah, they provide security formally, but they're also like taxing the local population through briberies or doing all like kind of work on the side, mediating disputes and stuff. And the police are also interesting because they're often the most visible arm on a day-to-day basis of the state in some of these countries, even ones that are considered fragile or where the state's considered weak. You could probably see a policeman on every corner of every street asking you for a bribe of some sort. So that it's really nice that they're being focused on by you. There was a couple of big ideas that I really liked and would love to hear more about. This idea of contradictory norms, the norm of public service that the police sometimes come up with, despite being in this kind of clientelistic state. Where does that norm come from? Is this something that's trained into them? Is it a legacy from some colonial service manual, or is it rooted in something else, something more local? I'm always interested in where the norms of governance and public service come from and how they've blended and changed over time. So I'd love to know a bit more about that. And then you touched upon it at the end, but your other big idea of episodic state capacity that happens around these election times, I put down, can it be bottled and stretched out? And you kind of said at the end, you're not really sure about that. So it seems to me, the question then is, what are the incentives at play when they're engaging in these election times? Obviously, you talked about there's much more accountability. The media and the world's attention are on the police. You talked about how they were moved from area to area. So they moved out of their old social networks, which probably facilitated corrupt activities or clientelistic activities, and put in new areas. But also, what do the police gain from being good actors or being good governance in those times of elections? Like, there must be some positive social norms or positive reinforcement going on there as well. Also, how did you guys get access to all those police stations? Amazing. I would love to know how did you negotiate that? How did that research happen? How did you gain their trust? It's really, really interesting methodology. I would love to know more if you'd like to tell us about that. And then, I'd also like to know a bit more about, you talked about these informal kind of election arrangements, such as the testing the machines or police being kind of caught up on the 65% participation threshold or benchmark. How did these come about? Like, if they're not coming down from some kind of UN election observer giving best practices, what's driving those informal norms, and what is it about India's democracy and elections that is so kind of intimately enshrined within its own self-image of a state? We often as outsiders talk about India being this beautiful bouquet of democracy, and we big it up in very many reasons, but I'd love to know how Indians see that, and is that part of their own understanding of statehood and the self? So yeah, that's my comments. I'm sorry it's a smorgasbord, but it's quite a bit lot to listen to, and I really enjoyed it. So please respond to what you want and leave what you don't want.
Some really good food for thought, Tom, and I think provoking the panelists as well to go a bit deeper into the propositions they were making in their presentations. I think I'll start by picking up a couple of things that you said and asking the panel to respond to those. Tom.
I don't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. So asking the panelists to respond to some of Tom's questions, and of course you can pick and choose, but I'd like to try and get you to focus a bit on two things that I think are quite important. One is, how do expectations of what people want from these authorities shape these interactions around norms, etc. And then the second thing I'd like to pick up from Tom's comments is the whole question of social networks and how important they are. Is there time, in a sense, to go back to this idea of social capital? And that comes across, I think, in all three presentations. So let me pose that first to you, maybe Kaz, or Judith, or Talatu, whoever wants to respond from the first presentation.
Okay, let me pick. Oh, let me pick on. Okay.
And if you could keep your comments brief, and people, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat as well. We'll have an opportunity to open the floor after this short responses to Tom's discussion comments. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let me pick on the issue of these marginalized groups where he talked about some are organized and some are not organized. So for the people living with disability in both states, you find out that most of them, we have learned people and basically people that are adult. So they have formed an organized group and they have an umbrella through which they speak to and the government recognize their existence. So talking about adolescent boys and girls aged from 13 to 19 years, they look at them as minors. So their decision does not count. They can only put out their demands to their community leaders or to the people in the community, the stakeholders in the community. But when it comes to informed decision making as things that affect them, it doesn't matter because they are not brought to the table to speak to those issues. So that is where we have the problem. Then talking about rural women, 18 years and above, of course, these are people that have little or no education at all. So whatever information they receive, be it on infrastructure, be it on agriculture, whatever their demands are, they get to hear this information from their community leaders. So as such, they are not part of decision-making. It is what is given to them that they accept like that. So, but we have the people living with disabilities as a group, and these are educated people, and we have people that are matured. So they have that direct access to the government official, and as such, they have more of this linkage, and their voices are being heard in decision-making process. Let me just stop at this.
Thank you. Maybe I can also come in and speak to some of the things. Thank you so much, Tom, for your very insightful questions, which challenge us to even think deeper. Let me maybe respond to a few of the questions. When you talked about whether the people with disabilities expect services from public health service providers or they are giving a free pass to government. Actually, in reality, they still do expect, because public health facilities will be cheaper. So they would rather go there than go to a private hospitals, which charges higher. The government also has a social protection scheme that is called the Assisted Medical Treatment Order, which would be acceptable in public health institution. However, the challenge there is most of them are not even aware of it. We have indicated that there are no institutionalized platforms for engaging with people with disabilities. So that information is not known to most of them, so they would not use that. Where they are, some of them are not even accessible. So while they still do expect to get services from there, there are all these barriers which inhibit them from getting that. And then you asked about the medical aid, why more than 80%, almost 89% are not covered. The reality is most of the people with disabilities are actually in the informal sector. Medical aid coverage is very expensive, even for the ordinary people in Zimbabwe. Mm-hmm. So invariably, they are on the end of affordability of the medical aid schemes. So they are not able to then be covered in that. And while I even spoke about the Assisted Medical Treatment Order, which is available, because there is no institutionalized way of getting information to and from these groups, it means some of them are not even aware that is there. So they're not even covered by it, even if it's in existence. And Tom, you also asked about the role of associations, why there are people who are not members. There is the rural-urban divide. The situation is that the associations that are there, most of them are mostly in the urban areas. Our study covered both the rural and the urban. So by virtue of them being in the urban, it means issues of reaching them, of coverage, is also really exclusionary in that way. So some of them are not members due to that. However, at this point, we acknowledge that the new policy is setting out guidelines for setting out those associations. So we do hope with constant push, the realization of that can try and mitigate that issue. Maybe lastly, let me speak about the weak governance. We are not saying members, people with disabilities are engaging with associations maybe results in weak governance. But what we are saying is because there is no official platform that is continuously engaging, that is intentionally engaging with people with disabilities, the associations that are there are not all inclusive, like we've already seen, there's the rural-urban divide. So the participation of people with disabilities is not all the time happening. And it almost then gives, to borrow from your expression, gives a free pass to government to not deliver on their obligation because nobody is bringing them to account. So associations are good, but at the moment they need to be strengthened so that they are also more inclusive, so that the participation can be more effective. I think I'll end there, Anne, for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Let's move to Myomin or Katrina. Do you want to respond to any of the comments very briefly? Because I do want to open the floor as well.
Sure, let me start, and Myomin, feel free to come in at the end. I'll pick up quickly on the point about expectations. So we did quite a bit of focus in the first phase, talking to households about their expectations. What came out quite strongly is in terms of access to basic services, people do have an expectation that, for example, there's a school in their village or that they can access a medical professional if they need to. There is very little expectation that that comes from any particular kind of duty bearer. So expectations on government, for example, incredibly low. And there was a lot of kind of feeling of it kind of being futile, or why would you go to a government? They're not going to do anything, et cetera, et cetera. But then that also came out in terms of some of the ethnic groups as well. So it's what we kind of concluded from this is, whilst there is expectations, there isn't a direct connection as to who is responsible for providing that. And that takes me a little bit to your comment about forum shopping. So yeah, I think we did see quite a lot of this. It really did just, it differed depending on what community you were looking at and therefore what the network was. So in some locations, there was only one authority, so there was it wasn't going on, whereas others, it would also depend on the topic. So we were seeing situations down in the southeast where someone might go to the KNU, for example, as an avenue to get to the government. So the KNU would then take that into the government. So there was lots of different variety in terms of how people were engaging. The point on agency, I think, is really critical and was one of the key findings, is that it's not the people that bring the problems that get to choose where they go. It's the intermediaries. So you kind of look at a community and think, okay, there's multiple public authorities in this area, you get choice, but actually their engagement is with largely one intermediary, and then that intermediary has the choice, to a degree, the choice where they go. There's definitely situations where, for example, the presence of a KAO officer in the village would take the choice away with that, or proximity is changing it, etc., etc. But I'm going to leave it there because of comments, but just to say your point about post-conflict and conflict really affecting it, I think is super critical. So thank you for picking that up. Annie, over to you.
Myomin, did you want to add anything? You're on mute.
Yeah, just want to give one food for thought, is that one of our finding is the administrator, they made the decision on trial on the cases, but the law not allow them to make the trials. if you give them to make the trial decision in the community, it's problem. But in reality, in the ground, in the practice, people don't want to go to the public authority, so they prefer to sort of issue it. Okay, so we are talking about in our programming to design the program for the whether you be at the capacity of the military administrator to do on the issue with the based on the human right, or whether you be at the capacity of the military administrator to understand the law. So we would think about, okay, to be at the capacity of the administrator regarding the law, how to solve the issue based on the human rights.
Very important, I think, and quite interesting that the fact the communities actually rely on this informal, not allowed by law process to resolve their issues. Let's move on to Akshay, if you wanted to make a few responses to Tom's comments.
Sure. Thanks, Anu. And Tom, thank you for these thoughtful comments. A lot for me to reflect on here. But a couple of things. One is your question about where norms originate from. I think that's a perennial question for social science, actually. It's extremely difficult to pinpoint the origins, but some thoughts on where this thread emerges within the police. One, it's interesting if you look at the sort of formal incentives within the police in India, particularly among the lower ranks who comprise 85% of the police. So that's constable, going up to head constable and sub-inspector. The odds of promotion are quite low. You won't get promoted, I mean, maybe in 10 years you'll get one, or 14 years you'll get two, and that'll be the end. So police are always looking for other sources of positive reinforcement and value in their work. And so one source of that is society. And so in their interactions with society, they are highly respected among large segments of society, even if they're not respected within the force. There's a kind of, you could say, a caste system within the police, where you have this very senior, the Indian Police Services kind of nationally recruited officer cadre, and then you have the rank and file. And it's almost like two different cultures within the police. And so the police at the kind of the 85% who work on the front lines are often seeking positive reinforcement from society. So that could be one place where it comes from. But I also see it coming out of, incidentally, out of police training. So we kind of, in part of our research, I did kind of a longitudinal study of training over 1 year with officers entering the force. It was mainly on women in the police. It was to study their integration. And what we found is that actually there's very little training around social service activities and building trust with communities and so on. But when the officers are put into field posts as part of their training, they almost have to do it. It's kind of they're forced to build these social ties and build some degree of respect within the community, and they learn it on the job. Rather than it being institutionalized into their training. And that's part of kind of our policy implications of some of our work, is to actually begin to institutionalize some of this. We've seen this around COVID, by the way. The police in Madhya Pradesh and other Indian states have been doing a lot of the frontline work, not just imposing lockdowns, which has been sometimes in a heavy-handed way, but also providing medicines, transport, teaching about mask wearing and various other things, which this is a role that is not at all trained. It's kind of learned on the job. Episodic state capacity, can it be bottled and stretched out? I think to some degree. So it's interesting that the same approaches that I observed during elections, I also saw taking place during large-scale religious events. So the police have to manage festivals, and in India, there's festivals happening virtually every month. There's a major festival, not just like a small group, but a large gathering, and police do similar things and try to, in those cases, do even more in terms of trying to build in community participation in the oversight of events, ensuring traffic movements and so on and so forth. But this really, I don't think it can be bottled and stretched out into everyday quotidian policing, which means like crime investigation, the sort of everyday interaction with marginalized groups who come forward with cases. And we see that in our work on crimes against women in particular, that, the kind of attention and capacity that's driven for large-scale law and order is just, it kind of evaporates when you look at the local level kind of everyday policing for individual citizen complaints. And so I do think there is a kind of a tension between these two, and I don't think capacity is fully fungible across these different tasks. And that kind of gets at the the sort of last point, which is understanding how is it that sort of accountability and incentives can be reinforced on the positive side. So what I find is that it's actually a lot of it is informal recognition within the police. So this was sitting in a police vehicle, I heard the chief congratulating the officers for no event happening around a voting booth. And with that, they got some small little pay, like 100 rupees. That means nothing to them. They collect 10 times that in a typical traffic stop if they want to collect a bribe. But it's the recognition that they did this good work, and someone's giving them that sort of positive feedback in a semi-public fora within the organization, because it went to all the police radios that these officers did a great job. That seems to matter, and it's almost in line with Judith Tender's work on good government in Brazil, and the kind of informal recognition that frontline workers get from senior level functionaries within their agencies. But that's just a speculation. I'm not sure how much that can kind of be institutionalized and work as a positive reinforcement. But I do think at some level the officers are really seeking this, because they're not getting it from the career incentives and rewards. I'll just pause there. Thanks.
Wonderful, Akshay. Thanks for those reflections. I'm going to open the floor. I have some questions of my own, but I won't start with them. So the floor is open. If you could raise your hands. I see Miguel.
Thank you. It was great to listen to all three. And I think the part that is even more exciting is that none of you have finished your research, which means we can add things for you to think of and complicate and think. I'm not going to talk about Myanmar, Katrina and Myo Min, because we work together. So but in the case of the Talatu and Judith and Kas, I think for me, what I would be interested in hearing more about is the variation within the association. So for instance, in Zimbabwe, the people with disability associations kind of open up a bit more of who are the actors, what are the interests, what networks do they use, but also the use of the network, so the networking itself. I think there's a lot of stuff there that I would love to hear. And equally, again, in the Nigerian case, which is the Latu, you mentioning, well, it's the group leaders, traditional leaders, this is the counselors. I wanted to hear more about those relationships. So that's what I would like to read more about. When it comes to Akshay, you work with bureaucrats and street level bureaucracies. You got me at hello. There's so many things here. And I think, there's a few things that would be interesting for you to do. Again, me talking. One of them is, do you know Ollie at Oxford? Ollie Owen. So Ollie works, I think he edited a book as well on police and street level bureaucracy and police in Africa. Ollie has done quite a bit of work on in Nigeria in particular. But there's that, I know, wrong continent, but there's a lot of interesting literature that you could engage with, because all of these guys do a lot of political anthropology, and I think that's really nice niche there. The other thing, Tom already said this. There's two things there. One is the informal norms. Where do they come from? And I think there's a lot of contradictions that you could play with in your data. For instance, police agencies redeem themselves, built public trusts. They built public legitimacy during elections. Who says this? There's a lot of, even now you're just saying that the way people look at, or citizens look at police. I was thinking Ali Timali did a very interesting research next door in Pakistan on citizens' perceptions of police in Lahore. And one of the kind of the fun findings was that they find that citizens think police are effective, they're just not honest nor fair. And it'd be interesting to kind of counter a lot of the things, like the case of your police officers, they're going for status, but don't they know that police are badly seen as well, and kind of play around with these contradictions. And then my final point is, again, Tom picked on this as well. It's that episodic state capacity that you're talking about. And what I was thinking was, there's a whole literature on the islands of efficiency, of effectiveness, and pockets of effectiveness. And Samin Ali, again, next door in Pakistan at LUMS, she just came out with a very interesting article on, so she turns the what's happening in terms of the way that politicians and bureaucrats work in especially at the Secretariat in Lahore. And she talks not about islands of effectiveness, but she talks about networks of effectiveness. And that's why these things are not sustained, is because, you bring in a good bureaucrat to fix the education department, and then, you're going to grab him once things get okay. You grab him and you put him or her elsewhere, and that's why there's no. And I thought, I'm just going to put on the chat the that reference, because I thought it would be really interesting for you. Again, there's so much stuff for you to engage here, and I think that's the fun part.
Really interesting. Any other questions? Let me just piggyback on Miguel's comment on Akshay's presentation. I was wondering whether really the police feel that they're respected, or is it fear? Because the perceptions of the police are more, in my limited sort of everyday pedestrian interaction, is one of fear, because they have so much power rather than respect. And is that what the police are picking up on? And the other thing I was thinking of was, again, taking on from Judith's work, can you say a little bit more about the sort of sense of professionalization of the police? Because early work that I was doing on forestry, a lot of it came from thinking about themselves as professionals, and these communities or these different influences of clientelism, etc., impeding people's ability to do their professional work, and that being a source of satisfaction. So that might be quite interesting. But other people, please feel free to ask questions of each other or comment, or do you want to respond, Akshay?
Sure, I can. So this is incredibly helpful. Thanks, Miguel, for alerting me to the work on networks of effectiveness. It's something I'm quite interested in, because I do think there's a similar issue going on within the police, where there are some officers that, I view them as almost institutional activists. They're advocating for disadvantaged groups, but they're often getting transferred around, so their projects don't last very much beyond their short tenures in certain positions. So I definitely see some overlaps there. To the question about respect or fear, I think it's a mix of both. The officers, how much they say that the communities they come from respect them, yet at the same time, the police's image is bad. So there's a view about police as an agency is depicted as a bad agency, and that's in movies, that's in popular imagery of the police, and also in media coverage. But then when you talk to them about their concrete neighborhoods in which they operate, or their own villages or communities that they come from their home districts, there they rely on this view that they are respected, and they think that they can have an impact. And fear is also there, though there seems to be, I think, not just based on social class, but also based on caste and other things. Some groups don't fear the police. Some groups actively interfere in their work and mistreat officers. I saw during my field work a traffic stop where the nephew of some elected official slapped an officer for stopping him. And so I think the police experience the front lines as one of both commanding some respect and some fear among certain groups, but on the other side, also feeling disempowered very often by their own agency and by political actors. So I think it's a very complex stand that they have. Professionalism is, again, uneven. I think among the IPS and the officer ranks, and perhaps even among the newer crop that are more educated. So one thing we find is the officers are more educated now than they were in the past. There is some sense of professionalism, but they don't feel the agency is professional. Certainly not. Anyway, I could keep going about that.
Tom, you had a hand up.
Oh, yeah. So it strikes me that something you said in your talk about how, day to day, the police are annoyed because elites come down and tell them stop doing X or stop doing Y, or, make sure this thing goes that way. And then when these elections happen, is part of that because, one, there's scrutiny, so the elites can't get away with it so much, and two, because they're not in their previous social context, so then the local elites don't know who these police are or don't know how to do that. I wonder if there's any natural experiments in India where the police haven't been moved around, how the elections work out in those places. That would be interesting to know. I feel like someone else has done something similar on moving police people around. I can't remember if it was India or Pakistan. There's some work. One of the labs, there's all these labs studies. So that might be an interesting thing to go down. Yeah.
Very interesting, actually, because a lot of studies of effectiveness show that one of the important factors is the long-term presence of the reformists within the organization in a particular way. So clearly there's something about transfers that undermines the good governance that's happening. I didn't give a chance to Judith or Talatu to respond to Miguel's issues. So let me hand over to you, Judith or Talatu, whoever wants to take it up.
Thanks, Anu. Thanks, Miguel, for your not interest in knowing more about the variations. I think it would be good to pursue more, but I guess at this point, it's quite important, yes, because what we even noticed ourselves was the association that we were working with to link us with people with disabilities in the area of our study. It's actually directed by somebody who is not living with disability. So you find that although among the sector, you have this expression, nothing for us without us, but on the ground, there are those variations. And for us at this point, we are actually excited that at least the National Disability Policy that has been launched is already speaking to setting guidelines of putting up associations. What is of interest for us and what we think we should be able to continuously monitor is the participation of the key stakeholders in setting up those guidelines, so that they're not a dictate of the ministry or government, but the people affected will then be able to stipulate what should constitute an association for people with disability. But I think it's important to continuously look at that, because we think there are interests in the sector as well, given on this example where somebody is not with disability but is running an association. So I think it's quite intriguing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. I don't know if Talatu, you wanted to comment, or Cass? There's an interesting discussion happening in the chat about how police, the people in Myanmar want to actually kill the police. And it raised a question in my mind, which I'm opening to all the panelists and participants, which is how much of this has to do with, formal and informal networks between the frontline state, so to speak, with the communities. Because in Myanmar, I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, Myomin, the police are very, very socially distant from the communities that they are supposed to be policing, as opposed to what Akshay was describing, that they get respect from their neighborhoods or their sort of places of origin. Kat or Myomin?
I can jump in quickly, and then Myomin, if you want to add. I think police actually just didn't come up a huge amount in the areas that we were looking at. And it was quite surprising. It did come up in some of the more urban kind of areas, but in the majority of the places, security came up a lot, and the need for security came up a lot. But that was often seen as the responsibility of a village leader to coordinate and organize. And ethnic armed groups actually people went to ethnic armed groups quite a lot for security. So yeah, not saying that they weren't mentioned, but didn't come up quite as prominently as we would have expected.
Min, you wanted to add?
Yeah. In some cases, community don't want to go to the police, sometimes because of like, if they lost their motorcycle, they don't go to police because their motorcycle don't have a license. So they don't want to go to the police.
Yeah, but what is the source of wanting to kill the police?
It's just an update, you know, because the police they stand for the military, so people don't like that.
Yeah. Any other final reflections? We're almost out of time. Cass, go ahead.
Anna, yeah, very quick. It's just a comment. First of all, thanks for the organization of this panel in the way it has been done. I think it's important we recover panels as a space for discussion. I really liked Tom's role and then the questions. I think for our case, it's interesting, you know, we're just now end of field work and we started, I don't know if it happens to you, we started with one theory, Jonathan Fox's theory of vertical integration. Suddenly the data is telling you something different. It's like, okay, what do we do now? But I think it's really, I really like the issues of associationism, the return or the revisiting of social capital. And also, you know, as it happens with the informal economy, what happens when you formalize that informal economy? I think we can have this parallel in the associational world, because when you move from being informal associations or informal groups into becoming formalized associations, I feel that you lose people, like people with disabilities or people who don't have a formal education, etc. So I think it could be really interesting to see, based on what we'll definitely read that the networks, but also what happens with that social capital when it gets formalized, if that makes sense. I mean, that's the idea that I'm taking from here. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Cass. Any other final reflections? Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, on the social capital thing, I spent a lot of time when I was doing my PhD trying to understand and get my head around that literature. And I seemed to be at a point when 5-6 years ago that it was really discredited amongst lots of critical scholars, right? They were like, what's happened basically is, it seems to me that social capital got associated with formal CSOs and NGOs. Whereas what all your research seems to be saying is, no, actually social capital is important. It's just not in the, doesn't look like a CSO and it doesn't look like an NGO. It probably looks like the family bleeding into neighbors, bleeding into village elders, bleeding into someone you know who works in the police. So I don't think we have to throw social capital out. We just, like you kind of hinted at, maybe we should stick away from thinking about it in a formalistic way, you know, or as in an organizational, institutionalized way.
That's a very helpful comment. And let's end on that thought. Can we revive the concept of social capital and make it mean something that's more reflecting what we are seeing in our field research? So thank you all of our panelists. We've had 3 very good sessions over 3 days, and this one has been also, as the others have, very enriching. And thank you for sharing your work, even though it's not completed, because it's always difficult and challenging sometimes to expose yourself in this way. And thank you, Tom, enormously for your very helpful comments. And hope to keep engaged. Goodbye.